Okay, for this portion of the video, I'm gonna show you how I made the lift brackets for the front strut. So I have the knuckle off the car here, and this is where your strut goes, is right here. Bolts on there, and then you have your lower ball joint, and then your hub assembly. What I've done is I made a template out of cardboard, and all I did was basically went through and put the pieces up here. I used 2 extra bolts that I had, and I just wet the end with water and touched the end of the cardboard, and it made a little spot where it showed exactly where the bolts went through. And then I cut those 2 holes, and then I moved it down and did the same thing, and that gives me about 2¼ inches here, so that'll lift that front end. So I took this and made this out. I found what's helpful is after you make your length how you like it, there is another little template here that I made. If you were to put a pen on a level piece of paper or something, and if you draw enough lines on it, it'll start to give you a center point, so you can find that center point. I just used one of the pieces that I cut out from here with the X-Acto, and then once I found the center point piece, I grabbed the center point and punched a hole in it, and then I was able to go ahead and put this up, mark it off. I used spray paint. It made it really easy, so I just sprayed it, and then when I removed it, it had my 3 holes like I needed them. And then I took my center punch and had this piece here, lined it up there, and then snapped that down. That got me really close to where I needed to be. To mark my line, I found that if you use a scribe, it's a lot more precise. I've tried to use the hole saw, which didn't work as well, so I used this. It's called an annular cutter. This is a 16mm, and it gives the bolt a little bit of play, which allows you to adjust for camber. And also what I did is I actually had a failed attempt. This is a bracket that I made, and one of the holes is slightly too far off, and what I found is I either had too much positive or too much negative camber because I didn't cut them all together. So I used a dial indicator caliper. When I had my hole punch centered, I went ahead and just measured from the center point to the edge on both sides, and then compared the 3. And that helped so much. The second time around that I made it, and I used the exact same template both times, I cut all 4 of my pieces. I used a C-clamp, and I bit them all together. So I went ahead and I put all of the pieces in a C-clamp like this, and these are all bent, but I had all 4 of them, and what I did is I went ahead and made sure that they were all the same length, top and bottom. And then I only actually did the whole setup for one of the ones, so it was painted on the top on this one. And when I leveled all of these out, I marked them off using a magic marker. I did at the top and at the bottom. That way I could go ahead and keep everything straight like I needed it to. I would also recommend using that center punch to go ahead and like put a dot on these, because then you'll know 1, 2, 3, 4. They will vary slightly if you cut them all at the same time, but if you go from 2 on the left, 2 on the right, it'll make it much more straightforward and a lot easier when you're stretching your strut, or rather compressing your strut, trying to put these on. So I got these all down exactly how I needed, and then I grabbed that annular cutter, put it in my drill. I flipped it up. I had an extra set of hands and a bench vise, and made it really easy. Basically just went through all 4 pieces of plate using that center punch point with the self-drilling. It cuts through like butter. I have found what works really well, because it's all about chip evacuation for how fast things cut. I used a pair of N90 or N52 magnets like this. I used a pair of magnets like these, and I wrapped it in a glove, and it basically collects all of the chips, and it just makes it cut so much faster. Of course, whenever you're using a cutter of any kind, to prevent it from getting too hot, you're definitely going to want to use some kind of cutting lubricant, whether that be, some kind of oil or whatever you choose. But once you get all 4 of the plates cut, then I like to go and get the grinder with the sanding disc on it like this. I just use this guy here. It's just on a variable speed grinder. This grinder was really cheap. It was from Amazon. It's been great. And then I just go ahead and I scuff off the surface so that I have a chance to get some really good adhesion for the paint. So got all 4 of those on, and then you will need to source some bolts. They are M14s. You will want to have at least probably 8 of them. You only will need 6, but I found that sometimes, when you're having to pull it off and put it back together, when you're stretching that strut, sometimes they do get damaged. So the length that I would recommend using is probably a 90 millimeter. That'll give you enough to go through and not too much extra on the end. I used with what I had, and the ones that I used were 110 millimeters, which were way too long. I had to use a lot of washers just to go ahead and lock everything down. This is a prototype sort that I did. It's my first crack at it. I'm sure I'm going to do another one just for fun, but I'll need to make sure that everything is going to be legal and pass safety. I will go show you what the car looks like with a spacer on the front, and also what it looks like with all these plates and everything installed. All right. So this is what it looks like on the front end with the spacer and those plates that were installed. This is a 235/75/15 tire, and it tucked pretty well. I do have a 1.5 inch spacer. It's a hub centric. It basically means that the load is going to be carried on the center of the hub. I would highly recommend it, since if you're planning on doing something silly like this, you would want that load to be transferred onto the wheel bearing hub assembly and not onto the spacer or the studs. So we'll go up underneath real quick, just so you kind of see with the plates installed how they work. So you're basically moving the strut up 1 bolt, and then you're using those 2 pieces of plate to be able to attach it. And as you can see, the angle of the axle is not too terrible. I did have to adjust the tie rod kind of a lot, but also the space in between the strut and the tire is now okay, because you cannot fit a 235 on here without the spacer, because the strut, it would hit the top of the strut. It would never even go in this area here. The back, I did something a little bit different. It ended up being a lot higher than I was expecting it to be, but it's really actually straightforward to do if you have enough tools to be able to do a job like this. The plates on the front, this will be gravy. What we did is, in the back, is we took the entire axle, and now if you're gonna do this, it's gonna give you I'm at 16 inches from that center point to the ground, which is pretty substantial. That is basically, I had to rerun lines, and now you'll notice that the drums and everything are all upside down as well. Stock struts, no spacer. It's just running the whole rear axle upside down. The easiest way to do this, so you don't have to disassemble the rear drum brakes, is going to be to go ahead and switch the emergency cables, which are located just up underneath that metal bracket right there. You disconnect those 2, and then you pull the entire axle out as one, and it makes your job a whole lot easier. I do not like drum brakes, so they really fought me hard. But yeah, there is no spacer. That's exactly what it's going to look like there. See, 0 spacer on it, and this thing is just massive on the back. It's currently sitting at 28 inches at the lowest point of the bumper in the center right here. So it's super, super tall. I also wanted to include something. You cannot run the fender liners, even if you trim them, because you have to clearance the front bumper. Sorry, I didn't do the greatest job, but it functions. You'll also need to clearance the back one as well. And what I found is that it rubs on the inside of the fender liner there, or excuse me, on the body. So I had to clearance that back there, and I used a hammer. It worked all right, but it's a cheap car, so I'm not too concerned about it. And sorry to bounce all around, but there's one more thing about this back end that I wanted to mention. That sensor right there, you can see the little piece that's got cut off right here. This is your headlight level sensor if you have the HID headlights. So rather than trying to adjust them, if you just basically pull down on that, it will go ahead and make that adjustment for you automatically using the motors inside the headlights. So I figured that was a helpful little tidbit for me, and hopefully it can help you. Also, when you're bleeding the brakes, because the drums are now upside down and the bleeder screws are at the bottom, what I did is when I made my line, I went ahead and I just disconnected it from right here. I lifted it up, and I had my vacuum bleeder, my pneumatic vacuum bleeder, and I just kept sucking fluid down the line until I had good solid flow. I then went ahead and disconnected it and plugged it right back in here real quick, and it restored brake pressure. So that kind of tricked me a little bit last night when I was working on it. For cutting fenders, all of the sheet metal, I would recommend going ahead and outlining everything in blue tape before you start, and measure it with the dial caliber. Highly recommended, because it'll give you a much more accurate cut. Obviously you saw my cuts, they weren't the greatest, but they are the same on both sides. So I used these ones, they worked fantastic, cut through like butter. These ones have 21 teeth per inch, and this really did a great job. I would highly recommend using the jigsaw and a blade similar to this if you have, you know, a jigsaw. If not, you can use a die grinder, but I found that this just cuts through like butter. It can trace wherever you need it to. It happens really, really fast. It's loud, but you know, always safety first. Use hearing protection and eye protection. And so here's a side-by-side comparison. This one's still totally stock. This is the modified one, just to kind of give you an idea as to how much more. Good comparison is basically, looks like the bottom of the tail light on the lifted one is about the same height as the top of the unlifted one, to kind of give you a size comparison as to how much higher that is. So I'm going to hand this off. We're going to compare right here. So it looks like we've got on a stock Prius, the wheel well is just over 25 inches here, and over here the wheel well is currently, with the larger tires, is currently at 38 inches. That's just with flipping the axle, again, no spacer. So let's go back over to the stock one here on the front, see what its front wheel wells are, where they're at. Just under 26, maybe right around 26. And then with the larger tires and rims and everything, looks like we're about 31, maybe 32. So that'll give you kind of a good idea as to how tall this is.